The earth trembled just before dawn. It wasn't the kind of tremor that rattles dishes from a shelf, but a deep, guttural shudder that you feel in your bones, a vibration that travels up from the soles of your feet and settles in your heart like a cold stone. The sound came first, a low rumble that grew into a thunderous beat, like 100 hearts pounding in unison against the hard, unforgiving ground. It was the sound of horses, many horses, breathing fire and fury into the pre-dawn darkness. Then came the war cries. They weren't loud, not at first. They were sharp, piercing whistles that sliced through the cold morning silence like a freshly honed blade. They rose in pitch and volume, a chorus of vengeance that promised to tear the world apart. Martha stood barefoot on the warped wood of her porch, the flickering flame of her lantern casting long, dancing shadows that made the familiar shapes of her yard seem monstrous and alien. Her hands, chapped and scarred, trembled around the stock of a rifle she barely knew how to fire. It felt heavy, cold, and useless against the approaching storm. Through the thick, rolling fog of early morning, they appeared. They materialized like ghosts, apparitions born from the mist and the moonlight. 50 riders, maybe more, their bodies sleek and powerful atop painted war ponies. Their faces were terrifying masks of crimson and ash, streaks of black and white turning them into something not quite human. They were specters of death, and they were riding straight for her. At their front rode a man who seemed carved from the very rock of the mountains. He was wrapped in wolf pelts, his shoulders broad and imposing, his stare locked directly onto her, cutting through the fog and the fear. He held her gaze, and it felt like he was looking straight into her soul, peeling back the layers of pain and sorrow she had wrapped around herself for years. He raised a single, leather-gloved hand. The 50 riders behind him pulled their mounts to a halt, a sudden, disciplined silence falling over the land. The only sounds were the snorting of the horses and the frantic, panicked beating of Martha's own heart. Time froze. The world held its breath. And then she saw it. A sight so impossible, so gut-wrenching, that the air was stolen from her lungs. Riding on a painted horse just behind the wolf-pelted leader was a boy. A small boy with dark, familiar eyes. It was the boy she had found near death, the boy she had nursed back to health, the boy she thought she had saved. He was dressed not in the simple cloth she had given him, but in fine deerskin adorned with beads and feathers. He sat tall, his face a stoic mask, looking not at her, but at the horizon. Was this salvation, a reunion she had unknowingly facilitated? Or was it the most profound betrayal she had ever known? The boy she thought she'd saved was riding with the men who were here to kill her. And in that terrifying, heart-stopping moment, Martha knew that everything she thought she understood about her life, her past, and her future was a lie. Before we unravel the twisted path that led to this dawn, let me ask you something. Where are you watching from right now? Drop your city or country in the comments below. I love seeing how far these stories travel. And if this one grabs you, if it keeps you on the edge of your seat, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because the tales we have coming are darker and deeper than you can imagine. The dust was a living thing on Martha's homestead. It was a constant presence, a silent intruder that settled in the seams of the porch wood, in the fragile space between the pages of her worn-out Bible, and in the tired folds of the single dark blue dress she wore most days. Its sleeves were frayed, its color faded, a constant reminder of the relentless wind that carried it from the west. That wind was always dry, always full of whispers, like it had somewhere important to be and was burdened with too many secrets to keep. Martha lived on the fringe, not just of the land, but of society. Her small house, with its cracked shingle roof and a fence that leaned like a tired old man, was 30 paces past the old church bell that no longer rang. It was as if the town itself had decided where she belonged, just outside the circle of God's grace and community. She kept to herself, not because she was a recluse by nature, but because the townfolk had built a wall of whispers and sideways glances around her, a wall she had long ago given up trying to climb. They said she brought bad luck. They whispered that she saw things that weren't there, that she communed with the spirits of the dead. None of it was true, not in the way they meant it. But out here in the West, rumors grew faster and thicker than wild rye, and the roots of the stories they told about her had grown too deep and tangled to ever be pulled out now. There was a time, a lifetime ago it seemed, when she had walked with her head held high, when her laughter was a common and joyful sound. But that was before the fire, before her husband's final scream had been swallowed by the smoke and the ash, before the left side of her face had melted and puckered into a disfiguring scar that served as a permanent, ugly monument to her loss. Now, she walked with a slight, almost imperceptible limp, a stiffness that was always worse on cold mornings. Her voice, once clear and strong, had grown soft and hesitant, as if the world had pressed its heavy finger to her lips and commanded her to be quiet. And the town, in its own cruel way, had obeyed that command on her behalf. On Sundays, she occupied the back pew of the church, a solitary figure in a sea of families. The other pews would fill from the front, leaving a wide, empty space around her, a quarantine zone of piety. She was never asked to contribute to the potlucks. Her name was never mentioned in the prayer rolls. The preacher, a man named Geller, would offer a curt, almost fearful nod if their eyes met, but he never, ever said her name from the pulpit. It was easier for them that way. For Martha, it was just another layer of the suffocating silence that had become her life. The children were the cruelest, in the way only the innocent can be. They would stop their games and whisper as she passed, their mothers pulling them close, clutching their hands as if the scar on Martha's face was a contagion that could leap through the air and cling to their own perfect skin. She never scolded them, never offered a harsh word in return. She remembered being young, before the fire, before the war, before the kind man with the crooked, charming smile rode out one sun-drenched morning and never came back. He had been her world, her everything. Now she had nothing but the leaning house and the crushing, all-consuming silence. It had been 3 long years since her husband John had died. The war had officially ended months before, but death, it seemed, was a slow and stubborn messenger in these parts. He'd gone out to check on a neighbor's cattle, which had reportedly been wounded. All they ever found was his hat. It was lying in the dust near a dry creek bed, a single spot of blood on the brim and a clean, sharp hole through the crown. An arrow, they said, but there was no body, no horse, no trail to follow. Just a bad, unfinished ending and a host of questions that still echoed in her mind, louder and more persistent than gunfire. Martha had stopped waiting for answers. She had stopped speaking much at all. The land didn't need noise. It demanded hands, patience, and sweat. She cultivated a small patch of potatoes in one corner of the yard, their green leaves a defiant splash of life against the brown, dusty landscape. She fed the handful of chickens that scratched and pecked in another. The days bled into one another, slow, forgettable, and rough around the edges, like the wind passing through dry grass. One evening, she stood on the porch, watching the sun bleed out across the horizon, painting the sky in shades of whiskey and blood. The vast, empty sky stretched thin and taut over the distant hills. It was then, in that moment of quiet contemplation, that she heard it for the first time. A sharp, uneven gasp for breath, the sound of someone nearby, someone in pain. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't an animal. It was human. She grabbed the old lantern, its light a feeble defense against the encroaching darkness, and followed the sound. She found him just past the chicken coop, huddled and shivering under a thorny bush. He was a boy, no older than 10 or 11, his small, bare chest rising and falling in ragged, shallow breaths. His left leg was a mess, crudely wrapped in a strip of faded cloth, that was soaked through with a dark mixture of blood and dirt. He stared up at her, his eyes wide and wild, the desperate, alert look of a trapped animal. Comanche. There was no mistaking it. The proud, sharp cut of his jaw, the simple bone necklace that lay against his collarbone, the faint, dark ink markings that traced a pattern along his shoulder. By all rights, he should have run the moment he saw her, a white woman with a scarred face. But he couldn't. That leg was too far gone. He was cornered by his own injury. Martha didn't speak. She didn't want to frighten him further. She simply knelt down slowly, her movements deliberate and calm, her hands held open and empty at her sides to show she meant no harm. His wild eyes flicked from her open hands to her face, and then they locked onto her scar. He flinched, a small, involuntary movement. Most people did. But he didn't try to crawl away. Perhaps he was too weak. Or maybe, just maybe, he saw something in her brokenness that was familiar, something that told him he was safe. Without a single word passing between them, she gently lifted him into her arms. He was shockingly light, a bundle of fevered skin and brittle bones. Her own knees, stiff from years of hard work and sorrow, nearly gave way under the small burden. She carried him inside, into the quiet, dusty space that was her home, and laid him on the old cot where her husband used to sleep. She pulled a damp cloth from the wash basin and began to gently clean the gruesome wound on his leg. He hissed in pain, a sharp, serpentine sound. She just shushed him gently, a soft, soothing sound she hadn't made in years. No names were exchanged. He didn't know a word of her language, and she knew only a few crude words of his. But pain, she knew, was a universal language. And that night, in the dim, flickering light of the lantern, it was a language they both understood perfectly. As she worked, her fingers cleaning the dirt from the torn flesh, she noticed something small and glinting on the simple necklace he wore. It was a single bead, different from the others. It was not made of bone or wood. It looked like polished river stone, dark green with a strange, unnatural shimmer. It was a bead she had seen once before in a place she tried desperately not to remember. A cold dread, sharp and unwelcome, snaked its way around her heart. For the next 2 days, Martha nursed the boy in a state of quiet, anxious vigilance. She boiled herbs she had gathered from the hills, crushing the roots into a poultice that smelled of earth and rain. She tried not to think about the bead. She tried not to think about what would happen if someone from town, someone like Mrs. Avery with her sharp eyes and sharper tongue, happened to see the small, dark-haired shadow in her window, a shadow that clearly did not belong. At night, when the house was steeped in a profound silence, she would sit in the old wooden rocking chair, its gentle creak a familiar rhythm in the darkness, and simply watch the boy breathe. Each rise and fall of his chest was a small victory against the fever that raged within him. On the second evening, as the last light of day faded from the sky, the fever finally broke. He opened his eyes, no longer wild and delirious, and stared at the rough-hewn wooden ceiling as if he was seeing it for the first time, or perhaps remembering it from a long-forgotten dream. In the morning, he ate the thin broth she offered him. In the afternoon, he managed a small, tentative smile. It was the first genuine smile she had seen in months, maybe even years, and it did something to her. It felt like a small crack appearing in the thick, icy wall she had built around her heart, a tiny fissure through which a sliver of warmth could finally penetrate. She didn't ask him why he was alone. She didn't ask how far he had come, or what had happened to his people. She just knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her soul, that he was someone's child, and that somewhere out there, someone would be looking for him. And in his waking moments, when his eyes were clear, he would sometimes reach up and touch the strange green bead on his necklace. In his fevered sleep, he had muttered things she couldn't understand, chants and names in his own tongue. But once, just once, in a moment of startling clarity, He had whispered a single word in perfect, unaccented English. A name. He had whispered, "John." Martha had frozen, the spoon she was holding clattering to the floor. John, her husband's name. It was impossible, a coincidence. It had to be. This boy, this Comanche child from the wilderness, could not possibly know her dead husband's name. She told herself it was a fever dream, a trick of the ear. But the word hung in the air between them, a question she was too terrified to ask. How? How could he know that name? On the fourth morning, the wind changed. It had been blowing from the west, dry and dusty, but now it shifted, coming in from the east, carrying a colder, sharper scent. It smelled of rain, or maybe something else, something metallic and dangerous. Gunpowder. Martha stood on the porch, a tin cup of weak coffee held loosely in her hand. The boy was asleep inside, tucked securely under a pile of blankets, a picture of peaceful innocence. Her eyes, however, were anything but peaceful. They scanned the long, winding dirt road that snaked down from the hills, a knot of apprehension tightening in her stomach. That was when she saw him. Not a rider, but a walker. A lone, solitary figure dressed in a long, brown duster, his hat pulled low to shadow his face. He walked with a slow, deliberate stride, the gait of a man who had nowhere in particular to be, or perhaps a man who had already been everywhere and had the scars, both seen and unseen, to prove it. She stiffened, her knuckles turning white as she gripped the tin cup. Strangers didn't just pass through this isolated stretch of land without a reason, not this far out. When the man reached her leaning fence, he paused. One hand rested casually on the wooden gate latch. The other hovered near the butt of the revolver holstered at his side. His face was still mostly in shadow, but when he tilted his head up just slightly, the morning light caught the hard line of his jaw. It was a rough, weathered face, with a faint pink scar healing just beneath his cheekbone. He didn't speak right away. Neither did she. They stood there, separated by 20 yards of dusty ground, caught in a silent standoff. The only sounds were the restless whisper of the wind and the off-key crowing of a rooster somewhere in the background. Finally, he tipped his hat, a slow, respectful gesture. "Ma'am." His voice was low and gravelly, not hard, but not soft either. It was a voice that was used to being heard, a voice that carried just enough weight. His eyes, sharp and intelligent, looked past her for a fraction of a second, drifting toward the window of the cabin where the curtain had shifted ever so slightly. Maybe he saw the small shape of the boy inside, or maybe he saw nothing at all. "I ain't here to take nothing," he said, his gaze returning to her. "And I sure as hell ain't here to sell you a Bible." The corner of her mouth twitched. It was the closest she had come to a smile in a very long time. "What are you here for, then?" she asked. Her voice was hoarse from disuse, but it was surprisingly steady. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible shrug of his broad shoulders. "Heard a story in town. 'Bout a woman out this way who was nursing a wounded dog. Figured that might be a metaphor worth looking into." Her eyes narrowed with suspicion. "You a bounty hunter?" He offered a wry, humorless smile. "If I was, ma'am, you think I'd say so?" The silence fell between them again, stretching out like a tense wire. But it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It felt like two people testing the waters, seeing how long they could occupy the same space without needing to fill it with meaningless words. Martha studied him, taking in the calm, confident set of his shoulders, the way he stood, perfectly balanced and ready for anything. He didn't seem afraid of her, or of the isolation of her homestead. And more importantly, he didn't look at her scar with pity or disgust, the way everyone else did. He looked at her, right in the eyes, as if she were a whole person, someone who still existed beyond her disfigurement. "I'm not looking for trouble," she said finally, her voice firm. "Good," he replied, his tone even. "Trouble doesn't usually need looking for. It has a way of finding folks all on its own. He turned then, as if he was about to leave, to continue his journey down the dusty road. But he paused, his back to her. "You got any water?" She nodded, motioning with her chin toward the old stone well behind the house. Without another word, he unlatched the gate and stepped off the road, crossing the invisible boundary into her world without a hint of hesitation. He moved with a quiet purpose, as if he had every right to be there. They didn't speak much for the rest of that day. He drew water from the well, drank his fill, tipped his hat to her again, and then wandered off behind the dilapidated barn. He unrolled a small bedroll under the shade of a lone cottonwood tree, making a simple, temporary camp. He offered no explanation for his presence, and he made no requests. He just stayed, as if the land itself had opened its arms and invited him to sink into its dusty embrace. Through the grimy window pane, the boy peeked at the stranger, his dark eyes wide with a mixture of fear and curiosity. He said nothing, just watched the man move with a quiet efficiency. Martha noticed how the man, despite his proximity, kept a careful, respectful distance. He wasn't threatening, but he wasn't overly familiar either. He was a puzzle, a mystery that had walked into her life, and she wasn't sure if she wanted to solve it. Later that afternoon, she found a neat bundle of freshly cut kindling stacked on her porch. It was a small, simple gesture, but in her world of silence and isolation, it felt larger than it was. It felt like a word, a silent acknowledgement of her existence. That night, when the east wind picked up again, howling around the corners of the small cabin, she did something she hadn't done in years. She didn't lock the door. The stranger's name was Ellis, or at least that's what he told her. He didn't offer a last name, and Martha, a woman who understood the value of a buried past, didn't ask for one. She figured that out here. Everyone had a reason to leave certain parts of themselves behind, buried in unmarked graves along the trail. He didn't seem like a man who was prone to lying, just one who kept his truths locked away in a jar somewhere, far from prying eyes. By the second morning, he was helping her with the leaning fence. "Leans too far to the east," he'd said, his voice a low rumble in the morning air. "Ought to brace it, before a strong wind takes it all the way down." His hands were the hands of a man who was no stranger to hard work. They were worn and calloused, crisscrossed with a map of old scars. But he worked with a steady, tireless rhythm, like someone who didn't mind hard things. He never asked about the boy. He never asked about her scar. But once, as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the yard, he looked at her for a long, quiet moment. "The world ain't kind to those it can't understand," he said, his voice soft. "You seem like a woman who knows that better than most." She met his gaze, holding it for a beat longer than was comfortable. "I've learned that in a small town, a word travels faster than lightning in a dry sky." His presence did not go unnoticed. By the third day, the whispers had found their way back to her. Mrs. Avery, the self-appointed guardian of the town's morality, was holding court at the general store, her voice a loud, conspiratorial whisper that carried through the aisles. "A strange man," she was telling anyone who would listen, "seen walking the ridge near the widow Martha's place, had the look of an outlaw about him. And you know," she added, her voice dropping dramatically, "she's always been a bit strange, ever since her husband just disappeared." Someone else chimed in, mentioning that the town sheriff hadn't been seen in over a week. Another swore they had heard the faint, ominous sound of drums on the wind the night before. By sunset, the whispers had festered into suspicion, and the suspicion had curdled into action. 3 men, their faces grim and self-righteous, had ridden out to check on the widow. Martha saw them coming long before they reached the gate. She was sitting on the porch, shelling peas into a large wooden bowl, the rhythmic snap of the pods a calming sound in the tense afternoon air. Ellis was standing quietly in the deep shadows of the barn, ostensibly sharpening an axe blade, but she knew he was watching them too. He watched the three riders approach, lean, angry silhouettes kicking up clouds of dust, riding as if they owned the very ground beneath their horses' hooves. "Evening, Miss Martha," one of them called out, his smile a little too wide, a little too predatory to be friendly. His name was Tom Kinley, a man whose piety was as shallow as a dry creek bed. "Just came by to make sure you were safe. Heard tell of a lot of strange things happening lately." She didn't get up from her chair. She just continued to shell her peas, her movements calm and deliberate. "I'm fine, Tom." "We heard you might have a guest," another man said, his eyes scanning the property, looking for any sign of the stranger. "Thought we'd offer some company, keep you safe." Behind her, inside the cabin, the floorboards creaked slightly. She knew the boy was there, listening, his small body hidden behind the thin curtain. At that moment, Ellis stepped out from the shadows of the barn, casually wiping his hands on a greasy rag. He looked for all the world like a man who had just finished fixing a broken wagon wheel, not a man who was ready for a fight. But there was something in his eyes, a hard, cold glint that said otherwise. "Don't mean to interrupt, gentlemen," Ellis said, his voice calm and even, but with an underlying edge of steel. "But the lady's already got company, and I reckon that's all the company she's needin' tonight." The three men didn't like that one bit. Their horses shifted restlessly, their hands drifting instinctively towards the pistols on their hips. But none of them were stupid enough to make the first move. There was something about the way Ellis stood, calm and unmoving, that gave them pause. The leader, Kinley, spat a wad of tobacco juice into the dirt. "You sure know how to pick your friends, Martha," he sneered. She finally looked up from her bowl of peas, her gaze as cold and hard as Riverstone. "So do you." They left in a cloud of dust and resentment, their backs stiff with wounded pride. Martha knew, with a sinking feeling in her gut, that this wasn't the end of it. They would be back, and next time they would bring more men, and they would have fewer questions. That night, as a sliver of moon hung in the inky black sky, the boy finally spoke to her. He came to her as she sat by the dying embers of the fire, his small face etched with worry. He uttered a single word, a quiet, hesitant whisper from the dark corner of the room where his cot lay. "Father?" Martha froze, her heart lurching in her chest. She turned slowly, her eyes wide, and looked at him. He wasn't looking at her. He was pointing a small, trembling finger towards the window, towards the distant, dark horizon where the wind had shifted once again, carrying with it the low, steady, unmistakable sound of distant drums. A sound that was getting closer. But before the drums arrived, the townspeople did. They came at dusk, a grim procession of borrowed righteousness. Not warriors, not outlaws, but her neighbors. 3 women, 2 men, and at their head, Preacher Geller. They didn't carry torches, but they didn't need them. Their words, sharp and venomous, burned just as brightly. "You can't shelter them, Martha." Mrs. Avery stood at the front of the grim delegation, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her Sunday hat pinned so tightly to her curls it seemed to be pulling her face into a permanent scowl. "You, of all people, after what happened to your husband, have you no shame?" Martha stood in the doorway of her small cabin, a silent, solitary guardian. Her hands were clenched into tight fists at her sides, her knuckles white. Behind her she could feel the small, warm presence of the boy, hiding again behind the thin curtain. Ellis was nowhere in sight. He had ridden out early that morning to trade for supplies, and a desperate part of her wished he were here now, his quiet strength a shield against their hatred. "I didn't invite you onto my land," she said, her voice cold and devoid of the softness they were used to. "We're not asking for your permission, Martha," Preacher Geller added, his voice dripping with sanctimony. His well-worn Bible hung from one hand, not like a source of comfort, but like a weapon. This land doesn't belong to you if you're going to use it to harbor sin. Martha took a deliberate step forward, out onto the porch, pulling the cabin door shut behind her, shielding the boy from their venom. Sin? She repeated, the word tasting like ash in her mouth. He's a child. He was shot and left for dead. He's Comanche, one of the men spat, the word itself an indictment. And you've taken up with a drifter. Mrs. Avery's voice trembled with a mixture of fear and outrage. A man with a gun and no name. Do you think people haven't noticed what goes on here after dark? Do you think you can hide behind those scars of yours forever? Martha flinched. It was a small, almost imperceptible movement, but it was all the confirmation they needed. Their accusations had found their mark. The preacher stepped forward, his voice rising, taking on the booming, theatrical cadence he used from the pulpit. You've lived in the shadows for years, Martha, a penitent widow, but this is open rebellion against God and this community. God sees it, Martha, and so do we. She said nothing. She just stared at them, her face an unreadable mask, letting the weight of their judgment settle over her like a shroud. She let the humiliation rise in her throat like bile, burning and bitter. Then Tom Kinley, the man who had led the first group of vigilantes, stepped forward and threw something at her feet. It landed in the dust with a soft thud. A rag doll. A simple, handmade doll with red thread for a mouth and black buttons for eyes. She knew it instantly. Her breath caught in her throat. It had belonged to her daughter, Sarah, the daughter they never talked about, the daughter she had buried in a small, unmarked grave in the far field, years before the fire, years before John's disappearance. The memory, sharp and excruciating, hit her like a physical blow. Her knees buckled. You left her there, Kinley said, his voice low and cruel. You were chasing after John, trying to fix his messes, and you left your own child alone by the creek. You let her die while you were off chasing ghosts in the woods. Martha collapsed onto the porch steps, her chest heaving with silent, racking sobs. Her hands reached out, not for the doll, but to brace herself against the sudden, overwhelming sea of memory that threatened to drown her. No one moved to help her. No one offered a hand or a word of comfort. They just stood there, their faces grim and satisfied, their judgment delivered. Then they turned and walked away, leaving the rag doll in the dust, a cruel monument to her deepest, most private grief. Slowly, the cabin door creaked open. The boy peeked out, his dark eyes wide with a silent, shared sorrow. She quickly turned her face away so he wouldn't see the tears that now streamed freely down her scarred cheek. That night, she didn't pack a bag. She didn't take any food or water. She just walked out the back gate and into the dark, tangled woods, heading up into the hills. She had no destination, no direction. She was just moving away. Away from the whispers, the accusations, the suffocating weight of her past. The sky darkened behind her, thick clouds swallowing the moon, plunging the world into an impenetrable blackness. The cold crept into her thin boots, numbing her feet, but she didn't stop. Not when the sharp, thorny branches tore at her arms, leaving thin, bloody trails on her skin. Not when the distant, mournful howl of wolves echoed from the far-off ridges. She walked until the searing pain in her lungs with each ragged breath was the only thing that reminded her she was still alive. And then, her body could take no more. She dropped to the ground, her energy completely spent. And then the snow came. A cruel, unseasonable April storm. Fat, icy flakes began to fall, coating her shoulders, her hair, her outstretched hands in a cold, white blanket. She curled herself into a tight ball beneath the sheltering branches of a large cedar tree, her body trembling violently from the cold and the shock. She didn't pray. She had forgotten how. She didn't hope. Hope was a luxury she could no longer afford. She just waited for the cold to take her, to finally extinguish the last flickering embers of her painful existence. She didn't hear him approach. The snow muffled all sound. She didn't feel the gentle shift in the air as he knelt beside her. The first thing she felt was warmth. The surprising warmth and weight of a heavy wool coat being laid gently over her shaking shoulders. And then she heard his voice, soft and close, a low rumble against the howling wind. "I've been looking for you, Martha." It was Ellis. She opened her eyes slowly, the snowflakes melting on her eyelashes. He was kneeling beside her, his dark hair dusted with snow, his face etched with concern. "How did you—" she began, her voice a hoarse whisper. "You didn't say goodbye," he said simply, as if that explained everything. A bitter, broken laugh escaped her lips. "You don't even know me." He tilted his head, his gaze steady and unwavering. "Maybe not, but I know running when I see it. I've done my fair share." He didn't try to lift her. He didn't offer any grand, heroic speeches or false promises of a better tomorrow. He just sat there with her in the snow, a quiet, solid presence in the raging storm. He took off his own gloves, his hands rough and calloused, and took her frozen hands in his, chafing them gently, trying to bring some life back into them. He just let her shiver. He let her breathe. "I'm not strong," she whispered, her voice cracking, softer than the wind. "I wanted to be, for Sarah, for everyone. But they broke me, Ellis. They finally broke me, and I just let them." Ellis didn't argue with her. He didn't rush to disagree or offer empty platitudes. He just looked down at her hands, hands that were scarred from work and from fire, hands that were weathered like old maps, telling the story of a hard-lived life. "People like us," he said gently, his breath clouding in the cold air. "We don't get to break in public, so we break in secret, where no one can see. And then, when it's over, we get up and put the pieces back together." She blinked, a single tear tracing a path through the grime on her cheek. "I don't have any pieces left." He leaned in a little closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Then let me sit here with you while you gather some new ones." He helped her down the treacherous, snow-covered slope. He didn't carry her in his arms like a damsel in distress. He walked beside her, his strong shoulder a steady anchor for her to lean on, his presence a silent promise of support. Each step, painful as it was, felt like she was shedding a layer of old hurt, leaving it behind on the cold, dark mountain. When they finally stumbled back to the cabin, exhausted and frozen, the fire in the hearth was still alive, casting a warm, welcoming glow. The boy had kept it burning. He looked up with wide, worried eyes as they entered, then quickly scurried back into the shadows of his corner, but he didn't hide completely. Martha collapsed into her rocking chair, pulling the blankets Ellis handed her tightly around her shoulders. Ellis didn't crowd her. He stayed on the other side of the small room, a silent, watchful guardian. Later that night, long after the storm had passed, the boy finally emerged from his corner. He crept over to her chair, and without a single word, he climbed into her lap, burying his small face in her shoulder. She held him tightly, rocking him gently, the familiar creak of the chair, a comforting rhythm in the quiet room. And outside, on the porch, Ellis sat with the rifle across his lap. Not because he expected trouble to come knocking at their door that night, but because he knew that sometimes the bravest and most dangerous thing a man can do is simply to wait, with kindness, for the dawn. As Martha held the boy, a sudden chilling memory surfaced. The green bead. John, her husband, had given her one just like it, years ago. He'd claimed he won it in a card game. He'd been away for a week, on a hunting trip near Red Canyon. When he returned, he was different. Colder, and he had that bead. She had lost it in the fire that had taken her home and scarred her face. The fire she was now certain was no accident. The boy in her arms, wearing an identical bead, who had whispered her husband's name. The pieces were starting to form a picture she didn't want to see. She looked over at Ellis, who was now standing in the doorway, his silhouette framed against the moonlit snow. His gaze met hers, and in his eyes she saw a flicker of something. Recognition? Pity? He knew. He knew something about John, about the bead, about all of it. The truth was here, in this small, isolated cabin, and it was about to change everything. The thaw came slowly that spring, as if the land itself, much like Martha, was hesitant and unsure if it truly deserved the warmth again. Patches of stubborn snow still clung to the north-facing slopes, and the shadows of the treetops well into late April. But beneath the cold, white blanket, something was stirring. A pulse of new life, a quiet but determined will to grow, a fire that had not been extinguished. Martha found herself waking before dawn most mornings. It wasn't a chore anymore. It was a choice. She wanted to greet the new day. The boy, who she had started to simply call Boy, was still asleep on the new cot that Ellis had fashioned from scrap lumber and old rope. He slept soundly now, his small chest rising and falling in a steady, peaceful rhythm. There was no more flinching at every unexpected sound, no more feverish, tormented dreams. She would stir the embers in the stone hearth, adding fresh, dry wood. The soft crackle and pop of the fire was her favorite sound these days. It was a sound of life, of warmth, of home. Not long after, Ellis would emerge from the woods, his axe slung over his shoulder, his dark beard thick with the morning frost. He never knocked. He just entered, as if he had always belonged there. And somehow, over the silent, healing weeks, he did. Together they started to build things. Small things at first. A new, sturdier hinge for the back door. Shelves above the hearth to hold their few precious belongings. And a proper fence, one that stood straight and tall, a clear demarcation between their world and the one that had cast them out. Martha found a new purpose in the work, and her hands, though still scarred, grew steadier. Her limp didn't vanish entirely, but her stride grew stronger, more confident. The whispers in town hadn't died, of course. They still floated on the wind like bitter seeds. But fewer people dared to approach her gate anymore, not since Ellis had taken to leaving small, intricately carved bullets resting on the fence posts. It was a quiet, unspoken warning, a message that was clearly understood. They started trading in town again. Ellis would go, his presence alone a deterrent to trouble, trading smoked venison for flour, her chicken's eggs for bolts of cloth. Martha didn't smile when she accompanied him. Not yet, but she stopped bowing her head. She met their stares with a calm, unwavering gaze of her own. The boy remained hidden during these trips, a secret they guarded fiercely. But he was learning. He was a sponge, soaking up the English words he heard from Martha, from Ellis, from the world that existed just beyond his perception. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low behind the cottonwood trees, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Ellis leaned against the newly repaired porch rail. He watched Martha gently brushing the boy's long, dark hair, her fingers as gentle as a spring wind. "You ever think about leaving this place?" he asked, his voice low and thoughtful. She didn't turn to look at him. "Every single day." He nodded slowly, understandingly. "But you stay." "I stay," she said, her voice firm. "Because if I leave now, they win. They all win." He said nothing for a long moment. He just looked at her, his eyes tracing the long, jagged scar that ran from her temple down her neck. In the firelight from the cabin, it glowed like a trail of old, solidified pain. "I was ashamed of it once," she said suddenly, her voice barely a whisper. She touched the scar with her fingertips. "This, my limp, my quiet house, my silence. I thought I had lost all the parts of myself that made me a woman." Ellis shifted his weight, moving a little closer to her. His voice was quiet, almost reverent. Funny thing is, Martha, I never saw you as broken. From the first moment I saw you standing on this porch, I saw you burning. She finally turned to look at him, her eyes, tired but clear, lit from within by a new, unfamiliar light. Then maybe, she said, it's time I stopped waiting for someone else to put out the fire. The next morning they started something bigger. The plot of land out back was flat and rich, the grass thick and the soil dark and loamy. Ellis had found the rusted, broken pieces of an old plow buried near the barn, a relic from a time before the silence. Together, they repaired it. Together, they hitched up the sturdy mule Ellis had acquired and carved long, straight lines into the earth. They were planting more than seeds. They were planting a future. A horse ranch, they had decided, or something close to it. The boy laughed for the first time that week, a real, genuine laugh. It happened while he was watching Ellis, knee-deep in the creek, trying to coax a stubborn, wild colt back to the bank. The sound of that laugh, so bright and short and wonderfully wild, echoed in the small valley and stayed with Martha all through the night, a precious, treasured thing. But a fire, no matter how small, always draws shadows. And by the second week of May, the shadows arrived. Ellis had left at dawn, heading to the next town over to buy nails and a barrel of molasses. Martha had stayed behind to tend to the boy, who had bruised his ankle while trying to mimic Ellis's colt wrangling. She heard the sound of hooves long before she saw the riders. 3 of them, their coats dusty, their expressions flat and emotionless. These weren't town vigilantes. These were lawmen, or something that passed for it. The lead man was tall and lean, with a graying beard and eyes as sharp and cold as chips of ice. He dismounted with a familiar, condescending smirk, the kind of smirk worn by men who believe they know everything about the world and the people in it. "Martha Walker," he said, his voice a dry, rasping sound. His eyes flickered with a cruel amusement as he took in the scene, the half-plowed field, the boy peeking from behind her skirts. "Didn't expect to find you playing house with a savage and a ghost." She said nothing. She just stood her ground, her body a shield for the child behind her. "You know who I am?" he asked, enjoying her silence. She nodded once, her jaw tight. "You're Marshal Dent. Ellis told me about you." Dent chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Oh, he did he? And did he tell you he's a deserter? Did he tell you he abandoned a company wagon train under my command? Left 2 good men to die at the hands of the Comanche so he could vanish into the trees like the coward he is?" Martha didn't flinch, but she felt the boy behind her grab a fistful of her skirt, his small body trembling. Dent leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, his breath smelling of stale coffee and malice. "He's not who you think he is, Martha. He never was." That evening, when Ellis returned, he found her sitting on the porch steps, her eyes red-rimmed, but her expression strangely calm. The setting sun cast a bloody glow over the land. "You knew he'd come," she said. It wasn't a question. Ellis dismounted, his movements slow and weary. He nodded. "I figured he would sooner or later. It was just a matter of time." "Is it true?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "What he said? About the wagon train?" Ellis crouched down beside her, resting his strong hands on his knees. He stared out at the horizon for a long moment before he spoke. "It's true," he said, his voice heavy with a pain that was years old, "but not the way he tells it." She waited, her heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm in her chest. "We weren't just a wagon train," he began, his voice low and strained. "We were soldiers, under Dent's command. We were ordered to clear out a Comanche family that was camped near the Red Canyon River. They hadn't attacked anyone. They hadn't stolen any cattle. Their only crime was living too close to the land the railroad wanted." He swallowed hard, the memory clearly painful. 2 of our men, eager to prove themselves, went ahead of the main party, By the time I caught up to them, it was already done. The whole family, slaughtered. He paused, his jaw working. I couldn't stomach it, Martha. I couldn't be a part of it. I buried the dead as best I could, a woman, and her husband. I left my badge pinned to Captain Dent's saddle and I walked away. I've been running ever since. Martha looked at him, her eyes full of a gathering storm and a sudden, shocking clarity. The pieces were clicking into place, forming a picture that was more horrifying than she could have ever imagined. The green bead, Red Canyon, the boy, John. You weren't just running, she said, her voice trembling with the force of her realization. You were hunting. Ellis finally looked at her, and in his eyes she saw the confirmation of her deepest, darkest fear. I was hunting for the man who led the raid, he said, his voice raw. The man who gave the order to those 2 soldiers. The man who took something from the woman's body before he left her for dead. He looked down at his own hands. The man who disappeared before I could find him. Your husband, Martha. John. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The air grew thin. Martha felt as if she was falling from a great height. Her husband, John. The hero. The victim of a savage attack. It was all a lie. A carefully constructed lie that had defined her existence for years. The scar on her face began to throb, a phantom pain from a wound that was deeper than flesh. It wasn't from a house fire. It was from John's ring, the last time she had confronted him about his secrets, about the darkness she saw growing in his eyes. The boy, she whispered, her voice a strangled gasp. He wasn't there that day, Ellis said quickly. He was with his grandfather. But the woman, she was his mother. The man John killed was his father. The boy is the last of that line. And then the most devastating piece of the puzzle slammed into place. The boy came outside then, his ankle forgotten. He was holding a small, crudely carved wooden horse that Ellis had whittled for him. He walked over to Ellis and silently placed the horse in his lap. Then he turned and climbed into Martha's arms, burying his face in her neck, seeking a comfort that she no longer knew how to give. She didn't ask Ellis to leave, and he didn't run. That night, they didn't prepare for a fight with the law. They didn't prepare for a war with the Comanche. They prepared for the truth. The next morning, Martha rode into town alone. Her dark hair was braided neatly, her dress was simple but clean, and the rifle was strapped securely across her back. She didn't ride to the general store or the blacksmith. She rode straight to the church. It was Sunday. She walked straight down the center aisle of the packed chapel, her boots making a loud, defiant sound on the worn floorboards. Every head turned. A collective gasp went through the congregation. She stopped right in front of the pulpit, where Preacher Geller was in the middle of a fiery sermon about sin and retribution. "You want to talk about sin, preacher?" she said, her voice ringing out, clear and strong, filled with a righteous fury that silenced the entire room. She looked out at the faces of the people who had judged her, whispered about her, and condemned her for years. "Let's talk about the sins of this town. Let's talk about my husband, John Walker." A nervous murmur went through the crowd. Preacher Geller's face turned pale. "You all tell the story of how he died a hero, killed by the Comanche," she continued, her voice gaining strength with every word. "But that's a lie. A lie you've all been telling yourselves to cover up the truth. The truth is, my husband was a murderer. He led a massacre at Red Canyon. He killed an innocent family for the gold they were rumored to have." She let that sink in. The silence in the church was absolute, thick with shock and disbelief. "And you, preacher," she said, turning her burning gaze on the man in the pulpit. "You knew, you helped him, you wanted his land. You helped him fake his death, making it look like an Indian attack, so you could get your hands on it." "This is blasphemy," Geller stammered, his face now a blotchy red. "She's mad. The grief has driven her mad. Has it? A calm voice said from the back of the church. Ellis stepped inside, Marshal Dent right behind him, his face a mask of thunderous rage. This woman is a liar, Dent boomed. And this man, he said, pointing a trembling finger at Ellis, is a deserter and a murderer. No, Ellis said, his voice steady and calm. The only murderer here is you, Dent. You gave the order at Red Canyon. You covered it up. You let John Walker take the fall, and you branded me a traitor to shut me up. The chaos erupted, but then another man stood up, the town blacksmith, a quiet man who rarely spoke. She's telling the truth, he said, his voice heavy with guilt. The preacher. He paid me to forge the Comanche arrowhead they found in John's hat. The foundation of their comfortable lies crumbled to dust. Exposed, panicked, Preacher Geller and Marshal Dent made a desperate run for it, shoving their way through the stunned congregation and out the church doors. They leaped onto their horses and galloped out of town, heading straight for Martha's ranch. They were convinced the gold John had stolen was buried there. Their plan was simple and brutal: kill the woman, find the gold, and disappear. As they thundered down the road, a new sound began to rise on the wind. The low, steady, ominous beat of drums. The earth trembled as the sun began to crest the eastern hills, painting the sky in fiery shades of orange and red. This time Martha was not alone on her porch. She stood tall, the rifle held firmly in her hands, no longer trembling. Beside her, Ellis stood, his own revolver drawn, his jaw locked, his eyes steady and clear. Between them stood the boy, barefoot and small, but he wasn't hiding. He was holding Martha's hand, his grip tight and certain. They were not looking at the road from town. They were looking towards the hills. 50 riders, silent shadows on horseback, emerged from the morning mist. Not a single war cry, not a single wasted motion, just the steady, inexorable thunder of hooves over the thawed earth. The Comanche had arrived. They were not here for revenge. They were here for the boy. And his grandfather, the man in the wolf pelts, rode at their head. At that exact moment, 2 more riders came storming up the road from the opposite direction. Preacher Geller and Marshal Dent, their faces contorted with greed and panic. They skidded to a halt in the yard, caught in a deadly trap. In front of them stood Martha and Ellis, armed and ready. Behind them, blocking their only escape, stood 50 of the most feared warriors on the plains. The Comanche leader, the great chief, dismounted. His movements were fluid and graceful, full of a power that was both physical and spiritual. He was tall and broad, his braided hair streaked with silver, his face a testament to a life of hardship and leadership. He didn't look at Ellis. He didn't look at the 2 panicked men. His gaze went straight to Martha, and then slowly it dropped to the small boy clutching her hand. No one spoke. The world held its breath. Then, the boy let go of Martha's hand and took a single, hesitant step forward. He said something in his own language, his small voice clear and steady in the silent morning air. The chief's stern, weathered face softened. He knelt down, his movements slow and deliberate, and opened his arms. The boy ran to him. The chief gathered his grandson into his arms, pressing his face into the boy's dark hair. It was not the embrace of a fierce warrior, but the desperate, loving embrace of a man who thought he had lost everything and had just found it again. After a long, emotional moment, the chief stood, his grandson held securely in one arm. He looked at Martha again. This time, he gave a slow, deliberate nod. It wasn't a nod of gratitude or of politeness. It was a nod of deep, profound recognition. She had saved his bloodline, and for that, she would forever be a part of his people's story. He looked at the 2 terrified men, Geller and Dent, and his face hardened into a mask of cold fury. He spoke a single, guttural word to his warriors, but then he did something no one expected. He stepped aside and gestured to the boy, a silent question passing between them. He was letting his grandson decide their fate. The boy looked at his grandfather, the powerful chief. Then he looked at the two men who had helped bring so much pain into his life. Then his dark eyes found Martha and Ellis. He looked at them for a long, heart-wrenching moment. He then took Martha's hand again, his small fingers sliding between hers, a small, warm, and certain anchor in a world that had been turned upside down. In that single, silent moment, 50 Comanche warriors bowed their heads in a gesture of respect and silent agreement. No words were needed. No ceremony was performed. Just a simple, profound truth, shared between people who had all lost and all found, things that were too sacred to be explained with words. The chief then turned his attention back to Geller and Dent. He pointed a finger at them and then at the ground. They understood. They were to be judged here and now. "The gold," Dent stammered, his voice thin with terror. "Where is the gold John stole?" Martha looked at the terrified preacher, a cold, hard smile touching her lips for the first time. "You want the gold, preacher? You've been ringing it every Sunday for the last 3 years." Their faces went blank with confusion. "John melted it down," she explained, her voice ringing with the clear, beautiful sound of truth. "He used it to forge the new bell for your church, the symbol of your piety, your greed, hanging right above your head all this time." The irony was so staggering, so perfect, that for a moment, even the Comanche warriors seemed to smile. The chief spoke a sharp command. 2 of his men seized the preacher and the marshal, binding their hands. Their justice would be swift, and it would be far from the white man's laws. The Comanche stayed only until the sun had cleared the highest ridge. Then, with their prisoners in tow, they vanished back into the hills, as silent and mysterious as smoke returning to the wind. 3 days later, the town gathered at the small chapel once more. Not for a funeral, but for a wedding. It was a quiet affair, with no music and no flowers, just the hushed whispers of a humbled congregation and the silent tears of those who, at long last, were able to see Martha for who she truly was. Ellis didn't wear a suit. Martha didn't wear white. But around her wrist she wore a simple, beautiful necklace of polished hawk feathers, a gift from the boy. And when Ellis kissed his bride, the afternoon light streaming through the stained glass window caught the scar on her neck, not as a mark of shame, but as a crown. The town never spoke much of it afterward. Some of the old guard still turned their heads away when she passed. But others, the baker, the blacksmith, even Mrs. Avery, who had once called her cursed, began to nod in the streets. And then, the nods turned into quiet hellos. Small cracks of light in a wall of old stone. The ranch grew, the fences multiplied. A sturdy smokehouse was built, and in the spring, wild colts, the descendants of the one Ellis had chased through the creek, ran through the new pastures, their manes catching the golden light of the sun. They named the boy Thomas, after a man Ellis had known long ago, a good man, a name to honor the dead, and to begin again. One cold winter evening, years later, Martha sat by the crackling fire, watching Ellis expertly mend a broken saddle. Thomas, now a tall, strong teenager, lay on a bear rug by the hearth, humming a soft, old Comanche tune under his breath. Martha looked out the window, watching the soft, slow fall of the snow beyond the glass. The world outside was cold and silent, but inside, the fire burned bright and steady. "Did you ever think," Ellis looked up from his work, his eyes full of a quiet, contented love, "that we'd get here?" "No," she said, her voice soft as she brushed a stray lock of hair from Thomas's forehead. "But I finally learned that you can't wait for someone else to come and rescue you. Sometimes you have to burn the whole world down and build a new one from the ashes." Ellis reached across the small space between them and took her hand. He didn't hold it tightly, but with a gentle, unwavering strength, that said he would never let go. Outside, the snow thickened, blanketing the world in a quiet, peaceful white. But inside, the fire burned on, a testament to the enduring power of love, truth, and the remarkable resilience of the human heart. If you enjoyed this story, and you believe in the power of second chances, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. You never know when the next story will be the one that changes the way you see the world.